1%. That is the number they repeat over the localized radio frequencies. A 1% survival rate for anyone foolish enough to breach the containment walls of Sector 0. They say it to keep us out. They say it to keep us safe. But lying in the mud, with the cold rain seeping through the torn seams of my hazmat suit, I realized the math was wrong. It isn't 1%. It's 0. Unless you know what I know. Unless you have the map that was shoved into my pocket by a dying scientist 3 days ago. I didn't come here to die. I came here because there is a rumor, a whisper buried under the static of the dead world, that somewhere in the heart of this necrotized metropolis there is a vial. A cure. Not a treatment, not a delay, but a reset button for the plague that turned humanity into hollow, screeching husks. The wire cutters in my hand felt heavy, slick with oil and rain. With a grunt that sounded too loud in the oppressive silence, I snapped the final link of the perimeter fence. The tension in the metal released with a sharp ping that echoed like a gunshot. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I waited for the floodlights. I waited for the roar of the infected. But there was only the wind, howling through the skeleton of a skyscraper in the distance. I pushed the chain link aside and stepped through. Welcome to the dead city. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the ruin, it's the smell. Even through the filters of my gas mask, which tasted of stale charcoal and rubber, the scent of this city penetrated. It smelled of wet ash, ozone, and something sweeter, the sickly, cloying aroma of rotting biological matter that had been festering for a decade. The air was thick, humid, and yellowed by the toxic smog that perpetually hung over the skyline like a shroud. I moved low, keeping to the shadows of the overpass. The concrete above me was weeping rust, staining the ground in jagged orange streaks. Abandoned cars clogged the highway, a rusted river of metal that hadn't moved in 10 years. Some doors were flung open, evidence of the panic during the initial evacuation. Skeletons sat behind steering wheels still buckled in, their skulls resting against the headrests, as if they were just waiting for the traffic to clear. My boots crunched over debris, shattered glass from windshields, plastic toys dropped by children, and the calcified remains of birds that had flown too close to the toxic plumes. Every step felt like a transgression. This place belonged to the dead now. I was just a trespasser. I pulled the map from my chest pocket. It was crumpled, stained with brown blood, and smelling of old paper. The scientist had circled the location in frantic red ink, St. Jude's Research Hospital, deep in the downtown district. He had scrawled a single word next to it, Genesis. That was the target. But getting there meant crossing 6 miles of urban hellscape. As I navigated through the gridlock, the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon of broken buildings, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and grasp at my ankles. The light turned a bruised purple, illuminating the spores drifting in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. They were beautiful, glowing faintly, but I knew that one breath of unfiltered air would seed my lungs with the fungus within hours. A noise stopped me dead. A wet, rhythmic slapping sound. Slap. Drag. Slap. Drag. I pressed my back against the cold metal of a delivery truck. My breath hitched in my throat, fogging up the bottom of my visor. I gripped the handle of my machete, my knuckles white. The sound grew louder, coming from the other side of the truck. It wasn't the wind. It was purposeful. I peeked around the rusted bumper. 10 yards away, a figure stumbled through the gloom. It was wearing the tattered remains of a police uniform. One arm was missing, the sleeve pinned to its side by dried ichor. But the worst part was the head. The fungus had bloomed from the eye sockets, a coral-like explosion of gray and red growths that had blinded the creature, forcing it to navigate by sound. It was a clicker, a stage 2 infected. It paused, tilting its distorted head toward the sky. It let out a chittering sound, like teeth clicking together rapidly. It was listening. It could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. The creature let out a low groan, swayed, and then turned, dragging its heavy leg toward a storefront window. I waited until the sound of its dragging footsteps faded into the ambient noise of the city before I exhaled. This was only the outskirts. If the rumors were true, the inner city wasn't just inhabited by stragglers, it was a hive. But I had to keep moving. The cure wasn't just for me. It was for the little girl waiting back at the outpost, shivering with the first fever of the infection. I adjusted my pack, checked the seal on my mask, and stepped out from the cover. The dead city was waiting, and I had 6 miles to walk through the graveyard of the world. 6 miles? In the old world, 6 miles was a 10-minute drive, a minor inconvenience of traffic and red lights. You could sip coffee and listen to the radio, and watch the skyline drift by in a blur of steel and glass. But here, in the graveyard of the century, 6 miles is a jagged, festering eternity. Every inch of pavement is a variable in a fatal equation. Every shadow holds a potential ambush. The concept of distance has been rewritten by the laws of decay. I stepped off the lip of the highway ramp, sliding down a slope of loose gravel and pulverized concrete. The noise of my descent, stones clattering against the rusted guardrail, sounded like gunshots in the oppressive silence. I froze at the bottom, crouching in a patch of oily weeds that had burst through the asphalt. My heart hammered against the sternum, a rhythmic thudding that felt loud enough to vibrate the seals of my suit. I held my breath, listening. The city didn't roar, it respired. A low, moaning draft swept through the canyon of skyscrapers, whistling through shattered windows and singing across exposed rebar. It was the sound of a giant, hollowed-out carcass being played like a flute by the wind. The street level was darker, trapped in an eternal twilight beneath the canopy of the overpass and the towering buildings. Here, the air was heavy, a physical weight pressing against the rubber of my suit. The humidity was trapped, creating a greenhouse effect that nurtured the fungal growths. They were everywhere. Great veins of violet and necrotic gray pulsed along the sides of the buildings, thick as tree trunks, throbbing with a microscopic, unseen rhythm. They had choked the streetlights, wrapping around the poles and crushing the glass bulbs, claiming the infrastructure for themselves. I checked my wrist gauge. The needle hovered in the yellow zone. Filters were at 60% efficiency. I had 2 spares in the pack, wrapped in wax paper and plastic, but changing them in this density of spores was a risk I wasn't ready to take. I tapped the glass face of the gauge, a nervous tic I'd developed in the first year, praying the needle wouldn't jump to red. It held steady. My boots felt heavy, leaden. I moved down what used to be Fifth Avenue. It was unrecognizable. The asphalt was hidden beneath a carpet of moss that looked soft but smelled of sulfur. I stepped carefully. The moss concealed hazards, open manholes, shattered glass, the brittle ribcages of those who fell where they stood. I passed a bus, tipped on its side, its metal skin flayed open by oxidation and fire. Inside, the rows of seats were occupied by skeletons draped in the tattered remains of winter coats. A plastic bag from a grocery store, miraculously preserved, fluttered from a skeletal hand, trapped in a breeze that shouldn't exist. I stopped to adjust the strap of my backpack. It dug into my shoulder, cutting off circulation. The weight of the equipment was a constant reminder of my fragility. Water, ammunition, the Geiger counter, the heavy metallic canister that would, God willing, carry the cure back. I looked up. St. Jude's was still invisible, hidden behind the labyrinth of the financial district. To get there, I had to cut through the banking sector. The entrance to the first major intersection was blocked by a barricade of military trucks, a relic of the failed quarantine zone. The canvas covers had rotted away, leaving the skeletal frames of the transport beds exposed. I approached slowly. The paint had peeled, revealing the dull iron beneath, but the white stars stenciled on the doors were still visible, ghostly reminders of order. I climbed onto the hood of a Humvee to get a better vantage point. The metal groaned under my weight, a sound of protest from a machine that hadn't felt a human touch in a decade. From up here, the scale of the destruction was nauseating. The street ahead was a river of garbage and debris, waist deep in places. Cars were stacked like firewood. But it was the silence that clawed at my sanity. There were no birds. No insects. The toxin killed anything with a simple respiratory system first. Only the mutated survived, and they were silent hunters. I saw movement in the periphery of my vision, a swaying curtain in a third-story window of a bank. I dropped low, pressing my stomach against the cold hood of the vehicle. I brought the scope of my rifle to my eye, the rubber cup sealing against my mask's visor. Through the scratched lens, I watched the window. Nothing. Just the wind playing with the shredded remains of an office blind. Paranoia was a survival mechanism, but it was also a battery drain on the mind. I lowered the rifle, my breath fogging the bottom of my mask again. "Focus," I whispered, the sound harsh and tinny in my own ears. "Do it for her." The image of the girl, pale and shivering on the cot, flashed in my mind. The black veins tracing up her neck like spiderwebs. She had days, maybe less. The thought was a spike of adrenaline. I slid off the truck and landed in a crouch. I had to navigate through the lobby of the bank to bypass the debris pile. The revolving doors were smashed, the glass granulated into diamonds on the floor. I stepped inside. The air here was cooler, stagnant. It smelled of dry rot and old carpet. The grand lobby, once a cathedral of capitalism, was now a tomb. The marble floors were slick with a black, viscous sludge that dripped from the ceiling. I avoided it. That sludge was the weep, concentrated spore runoff. One touch to exposed skin caused necrosis in minutes. I moved past the teller counters. Behind the bulletproof glass, money was stacked in neat piles, utterly worthless. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the gloom. I saw a skeleton in a suit, slumped against the vault door, a revolver on the floor near its hand. A suicide note was pinned to the chest, the ink long faded into a brown smudge. I didn't stop to read it. There were millions of stories like that in the city, and they all ended the same way. I found the fire exit at the back. The door was jammed, rusted shut. I braced my boot against the frame and shoved. It gave way with a screech that echoed like a scream through the cavernous building. I froze, waiting for a response. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing but the settling of the building. I slipped through into the alleyway. The sun was gone now. The sky above the canyon was a bruised plum color, transitioning to the black of night. This was the dangerous time. The twilight transition. The spores in the air began to luminesce, a faint, biophosphorescent blue that lit the street like an underwater cavern. It was hauntingly beautiful, a deadly aurora borealis at street level. But the light signaled the waking of the hive. I needed high ground. The street level at night was a death sentence. I spotted a fire escape on a brick tenement building across the alley. The bottom ladder was missing, but a dumpster had been pushed against the wall. I scrambled up the plastic lid of the dumpster, my boots slipping on the grime, and leaped for the lowest rung of the metal stairs. My gloved fingers caught the cold iron. The rust bit into the fabric of my gloves. I pulled myself up, my muscles screaming, the pack dragging me down like a stone. I swung a leg over the railing and collapsed onto the metal grating of the first landing. I lay there for a moment, staring through the slats at the alley below. And then I heard it. From deep within the subway grates, from the basements of the skyscrapers, a sound began to rise. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a chorus. A low, guttural chattering. Thousands of teeth clicking together. Thousands of throats expelling air through ruined vocal cords. The city was waking up. I pushed myself up to a sitting position, my back against the brick wall. I uncorked my canteen tube and took a sip of warm, metallic-tasting water. I watched as the blue glow of the spores intensified, swirling in the alleyway below. Shapes began to detach themselves from the shadows. Shambling, jerking figures moving with the erratic spasms of the infection. They were pouring out of the woodwork. I checked the map again, illuminated by the faint blue glow of the fungus. St. Jude's was still 4 miles north. I was perched on a rusted fire escape in the middle of an ocean of monsters, and the tide was coming in. I tightened the straps of my pack, checked the chamber of my rifle, and looked up at the skeletal silhouette of the city against the night sky. One step at a time, I muttered. Just survive the next minute. I stood up, the metal grating groaning softly beneath me, and began the climb to the roof. The real journey had just begun. The iron rung dug into my palm through the leather of my glove, a cold, biting pressure that grounded me in the immediate misery of the climb. Every muscle fiber in my forearms burned with a lactic fire, a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with the hammering of my heart. I didn't look down. Looking down was a luxury for those who weren't carrying 40 pounds of scavenged gear and the weight of a dying girl's future on their back. I focused entirely on the rust-pitted metal in front of my face. Flakes of orange oxidation drifted into my eyes, stinging like sand. The fire escape groaned. It was a low, mournful sound. A harmonic vibration that traveled from the bolts anchored in the crumbling brickwork right through the soles of my boots. This building was old, pre-collapse architecture, and the masonry was turning to dust. I moved with agonizing slowness. One hand up. Grip. Test the weight. Pull. 1 foot up. Plant. Push. It was a mechanical ritual, a prayer to the god of friction and structural integrity. When my head finally cleared the parapet, the wind hit me. It wasn't the stagnant, rot-filled air of the alleyway below. This was sharper, colder, carrying the metallic tang of ozone and the distant, briny scent of the ocean that lay miles to the east. I rolled over the concrete lip of the roof and lay flat on my back on the gravel-covered tar paper, gasping for air. The sky above was a vast, bruised expanse of violet and charcoal. No stars visible through the haze of particulate matter that perpetually shrouded the city. I allowed myself 10 seconds. 1. 2. The gravel dug into my shoulder blades. 3. 4. The sweat beneath my thermal shirt was beginning to cool, creating a clammy layer of moisture against my skin. 5. 6. I could hear the city breathing. It was a low-frequency hum, the collective sound of wind rushing through broken skyscrapers, of loose sheet metal banging against steel girders, and, underneath it all, that chattering. 7. 8. The chattering was louder now, rising from the canyons of the streets like heat from pavement. 9. 10. I rolled onto my stomach and crawled toward the edge, keeping my profile low. I pulled my binoculars from the pouch on my chest. The rubber eye cups were cold against my sockets. I adjusted the focus wheel, the lens whirring softly. The view was a nightmare painted in bioluminescence. The city, usually a skeleton of gray concrete and rusted steel during the day, had transformed. The spores, awakened by the absence of UV radiation, were blooming. Every dark corner, every sewer grate, every shadowed alley was glowing with a pulsating, electric blue light. It looked like the city had been submerged in a deep, radioactive ocean. But the beauty was a lure. Through the magnification, I saw them. The infected. They were no longer the shambling, dormant figures of the daylight hours. They were sprinting. I watched a pack of them, maybe 20 strong, surge down Fifth Avenue. They moved with a fluid, insectal coordination, climbing over gridlocked cars and barricades like a colony of ants. Their skin glowed faintly with the same blue hue as the spores, the fungus having colonized their dermis, turning them into living lanterns of the infection. I shifted my gaze north. St. Jude's Hospital was a distant monolith, a dark rectangle against the slightly lighter horizon. It looked impossibly far. 4 miles in a straight line, but there were no straight lines in the dead city. I would have to navigate the high road, the network of rooftops, planks, and fire escapes that survivors had cobbled together in the early years, before the population thinned out to almost zero. I pushed myself up to a crouch, keeping my center of gravity low. The roof I was on was a flat expanse of industrial HVAC units and rusted ventilation fans. The silence up here was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic squeaking of a ventilator spinning lazily in the wind. I moved toward the northern edge. The gap between this building and the next, a shorter, brick residential block, was about 8 feet. In the old world, a running jump of 8 feet was effortless. In this world, with a heavy pack, exhausted legs, and a drop of 6 stories into a pit of ravenous monsters, it was a chasm. I found the bridge. It was a pair of construction scaffold planks, lashed together with rotting climbing rope, spanning the gap. It looked ancient. Green moss had colonized the wood, making it slick. I approached it warily, testing the near end with my boot. The wood groaned but held. "Don't look down," I whispered to myself. It was my mantra. I stepped onto the plank. It bowed under my weight, a terrifying elasticity that sent a spike of adrenaline straight to my gut. I extended my arms for balance, the rifle strap biting into my neck. The wind gusted, shoving me sideways. I froze, crouching on the narrow wood, my fingers gripping the slimy edges of the plank. Below me, the alley was a river of blue light. I could see shapes moving down there, looking up. Did they see my silhouette? Could they smell the sweat dripping from my chin? A shriek pierced the air, a high-pitched, tearing sound that echoed off the brick walls. A screamer. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The shriek came again, closer this time. But it wasn't directed at me. Down in the alley, 2 packs of infected were clashing, a frenzy of flailing limbs and gnashing teeth over some scrap of meat. I used the distraction to move. 1 step. 2 steps. The plank bounced rhythmically. 3 steps. I was over the void. 4 steps. I threw my weight forward and scrambled onto the tar paper of the next roof, rolling away from the edge. I lay there for a moment, cheek pressed against the gritty surface, smelling the tar and the bird droppings. Safe. For now. This roof was different. It had been a garden once. Dead, skeletal trees stood in large ceramic pots that had cracked open from years of freeze-thaw cycles. Withered vines choked a wooden pergola. I moved through this graveyard of greenery, my boots crunching on dried leaves. It was eerie, walking through the remains of someone's sanctuary. A plastic tricycle lay overturned near a chimney, its color bleached white by the sun. I checked my Geiger counter, purely out of habit. The radiation levels were low here, background noise mostly. It was the biological reading that worried me. I tapped the face of my spore detector. The needle was hovering in the yellow zone. Caution. The air up here was cleaner than the street, but not by much. I adjusted my respirator, tightening the straps until the rubber dug into my cheeks. The seal had to be perfect. My stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting knot of hunger. I ignored it. Rationing was strict. 1 bar a day. I had eaten half a bar this morning. The rest had to wait until I found a secure shelter for the night. I reached the far side of the residential block. The way forward was blocked by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, separating this roof from the adjacent commercial tower. Someone had cut a hole in the wire years ago, the edges rusted and jagged. I slipped my pack off, shoving it through the hole first, then wiggled through on my belly. The wire snagged on my jacket, tearing a small hole in the shoulder. I cursed silently. Clothes were armor. A tear was a chink in the armor. On the other side, the roof was covered in debris. Piles of broken office furniture, filing cabinets, and shattered glass. It looked like people had tried to barricade the roof access door, piling everything they had against it. But the barricade had been breached. The door was torn off its hinges, lying twisted on the ground. The darkness of the stairwell yawned open, a mouth leading down into the belly of the beast. I skirted the opening, giving it a wide berth. The smell wafting up from that stairwell was foul, sweet rot and stale blood. Something had died down there, a long time ago, or perhaps a hive had taken up residence in the upper floors. I moved to the edge of the tower. The next jump was impossible. The adjacent building was 10 feet away and 5 feet higher. No plank. No bridge. I scanned the environment, my eyes straining in the gloom. There had to be a way. Then I saw it. A thick bundle of fiber-optic cables ran between the buildings, sagging slightly but anchored heavily into the concrete on both sides. It was a tightrope. I looked at my hands. My gloves were sturdy, reinforced leather, but were they enough? If I slipped, if my grip failed, I would fall 6 stories. I would be broken on the pavement, and then eaten alive. Do it for her, the voice in my head whispered. It sounded like my own voice, but younger, less broken. I slung the rifle across my back, tightening it so it wouldn't swing. I climbed onto the parapet. The cables were about waist height relative to the ledge. I reached out, grabbing the bundle. It was as thick as my arm, slick with plastic coating. I gave it a hard tug. It held. I didn't walk it. I wasn't an acrobat. I swung my legs out, wrapping them around the cable, hanging upside down like a sloth. The blood rushed to my head instantly. I began to shimmy. Hand over hand. Dragging my legs. The cable swayed wildly, dipping under my weight. Halfway across, I made the mistake of looking down. The blue light of the street seemed to be swirling, a vortex trying to suck me in. My arms screamed. The pack was pulling me down, the straps cutting into my armpits. My breath ragged in the mask, fogging the lenses of my goggles. Move. Just move. My hands slipped on a patch of wet grime. I lurched downward, swinging violently. My legs lost their grip. For a terrifying second, I was hanging by one arm, dangling over the abyss. A gasp tore from my throat, loud in the silence. I swung my other hand up, scrabbling for purchase. My fingers found the cable, locking on with a desperate strength. I hauled my legs back up, wrapping them tight. I lay there for a moment, suspended between the buildings, sobbing dry, silent heaves. 10 feet more. 5. I reached the concrete ledge of the higher building. I hooked a leg over the parapet and rolled, tumbling onto the hard surface. I didn't stand up. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the sky, watching the heavy, toxic clouds drift past the moon. I was 3 roofs closer. Maybe 200 yards of progress. 3.8 miles to go. I sat up and checked my gear. The tear in my jacket needed duct tape. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the roll. I tore off a strip with my teeth and slapped it over the hole. Survival was a game of inches, of patches and temporary fixes. I stood up, my knees popping. The wind was stronger here, howling around the corners of the high-rise. I looked north again. The hospital lights were gone, obscured by a shifting fog bank. Great, I muttered. Blind. I took a step forward, and my boot crunched on something brittle. I looked down. It wasn't gravel. It was bone. Small bones. Birds? Rats? I shone the faint red beam of my tactical light on the ground. The roof was covered in them. Thousands of small skeletons. And in the center of the roof, rising from a mound of debris and organic matter, was a growth. It was a massive fungal stalk, 6 feet tall, pulsating with a rhythmic, sickly purple light. Spores drifted from it like smoke. I killed the light instantly and dropped to a crouch. This wasn't just a traverse. I had walked into a garden. A incubator. And from behind the stalk, a shadow detached itself. It unfolded, limbs too long, joints bending at wrong angles. It didn't have eyes, just a sensory cluster of fungal plates where a face should be. It turned toward me, tasting the air. I slowly, infinitesimally, reached for the pistol on my hip. The rifle was too loud. One shot would bring the whole city down on me. The creature clicked, a sound like dry wood snapping. It knew I was there. The silence that followed the click was heavier than the concrete beneath my boots. It was a physical weight, pressing against my eardrums, demanding absolute stillness. The creature stood 10 yards away, silhouetted against the bruised purple glow of the fungal stalk. It was a caricature of a human being, stretched and distorted like wax held too close to a flame. Its limbs were impossibly long, the forearms elongated into jagged scythes of bone and hardened gristle. But it was the head that froze the blood in my veins. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blossoming explosion of fungal plates, layered like the petals of a carnivorous flower, twitching independently as they scanned the air for thermal signatures and vibrations. My hand hovered over the pistol grip, fingers trembling not from cold, but from a cocktail of adrenaline and terror. The calculation ran through my mind in a split second. A gunshot, even a 9mm, would crack through the canyon of these high-rises like a thunderclap. The echo would bounce, amplify, and announce my position to everything with hunger in its belly for a mile radius. The clicking sound came again, dry, staccato, like two stones being struck together underwater. Echolocation. It was mapping the terrain. It knew something had changed in its environment. It knew the topography of the bone pile had shifted. I slowly withdrew my hand from the gun. The leather of my glove creaked, a microscopic sound that roared in my own ears. The creature's head snapped toward me. The plates flared open, exposing the wet, pulsating raw meat beneath. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pressurized pipe. I couldn't shoot. I had to kill it, and I had to do it quietly. With agonizing slowness, I reached for the combat knife strapped to my chest rig. The blade was carbon steel, 7 inches, coated in matte black oxide. I gripped the handle, my knuckles white. I lowered my center of gravity, shifting my weight off the brittle carpet of bones and onto a patch of exposed tar paper. The wind shifted. It was the only luck I'd had all night. A gust blew across the roof, carrying the thick, sweet stench of the fungal bloom toward me, masking my own scent. But it also stirred the spores. They swirled around the creature like a glittering, toxic snow. I held my breath. If I coughed, if I choked on the miasma, I was dead. The creature took a step. Its movement was disjointed, a series of rapid twitches rather than a fluid motion. It raised one of those elongated arms, the bone spurs on its fingers tapping against the fungal stalk. It was communicating. Or perhaps it was praying to the thing that made it. I didn't wait. Waiting is dying. I lunged. I covered the 10 yards in 3 desperate strides, my boots thudding softly on the damp roof. The creature sensed the displacement of air before I even reached it. It spun, raising a claw to swipe, but I was already inside its guard. The smell hit me then, a wave of ammonia and rotting copper that watered my eyes behind the goggles. I slammed my left shoulder into its chest, driving the air out of its withered lungs. It felt like hitting a bag of wet gravel. We crashed onto the bed of bones, the brittle remains of 1,000 birds snapping beneath us. The creature screeched, a high-pitched modulation that I prayed the wind would carry away. I jammed my left forearm under its chin, or where its chin should have been, forcing the fungal bloom upward, exposing the throat. It thrashed with terrifying strength. Its claws raked against the back plate of my tactical vest, the sound of tearing fabric sending a jolt of panic through me. If it breached the suit, if it tore the biolayer, the infection would be in my blood before I could stand up. I brought the knife down. Once. Twice. I didn't aim for the heart. I didn't know if it even had one anymore. I aimed for the brain stem, driving the steel into the base of the neck, severing the connection between the horror and the body. Black ichor sprayed across my visor, blinding me for a second. The creature convulsed, a violent seizure that nearly threw me off, and then it went rigid. I held it there for a long time, pinning it to the roof, waiting for the tremors to stop. The purple light of the stalk pulsed rhythmically above us, indifferent to the violence. When the thing finally went limp, melting back into the pile of bones, I rolled off, gasping for air, my chest heaving against the straps of my pack. I scrambled backward, away from the corpse, wiping the black slime from my goggles with a frantic hand. I checked my arms. The jacket was shredded at the shoulders, the Kevlar weave exposed, but the inner rubberized seal held. I was safe. For now. I looked at the knife in my hand. It was coated in the dark, fluid, and fibrous gray matter. I wiped it on the dead creature's rags before sheathing it. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now. The adrenaline dump was hitting me, the crash that comes after the spike. I felt weak, hollowed out. "Move," the voice whispered. "Get up." I forced myself to my feet. The roof was a minefield. The massive fungal stalk in the center was clearly the source of the infestation here. It was feeding on the organic matter, the birds and rats drawn to the heat or the light, trapping them, consuming them. And then birthing these guardians. I skirted the edge of the bone pile, my boots crunching softly. I kept my eyes on the stalk, half expecting another shadow to detach itself, but the roof remained still. The wind howled, stronger now. I reached the far side of the building and looked down. The gap here was too wide. 30 feet across to the next structure, a residential block with shattered windows. But there was a fire escape. Not on my building, but on the one across the street. A rusted iron skeleton clinging to the brickwork. To get there, I had to go down. I scanned the roof I was standing on. There was a maintenance door, a heavy steel slab set into a concrete bulkhead. I approached it, the beam of my red light cutting through the gloom. The handle was rusted, fused shut by years of neglect and rain. I holstered the pistol, which I realized I had drawn again without thinking, and gripped the wheel with both hands. I gritted my teeth and heaved. Nothing. It was seized tight. I looked around for leverage. A piece of rebar, a pipe, anything. My eyes landed on the dead creature. It was wearing the remnants of a janitorial uniform. On its belt, hanging by a thread of rot, was a heavy ring of keys and a small pry bar. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and walked back to the corpse. Up close, the fungal plates were even more disturbing. They were porous, weeping a clear fluid. I tried not to breathe, holding the air in my lungs as I reached down with gloved fingers. I unhooked the pry bar, the metal cold and slick. I didn't look at the face. I didn't want to see what human features might still be buried under the growth. Back at the door, I jammed the pry bar into the seam between the door and the frame. I put my weight into it, leaning back, my boots slipping on the grit. Metal groaned in protest. Rust flaked off in jagged shards. With a shriek of tearing iron, the door popped open a few inches, exhaling a gust of stale, dank air. It smelled of mildew and old dust, a tomb sealed for a decade. I waited, listening. No moans. No clicking. Just the settling of the building, the groan of steel and concrete cooling in the night. I squeezed through the gap, stepping into the darkness of the stairwell. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the wind, the purple light, and the open sky. The silence here was different. It was enclosed, claustrophobic. The air was dead. I switched my light to the low-intensity white beam. The stairwell was concrete, utilitarian. Scorch marks climbed the walls, evidence of a fire that had burned itself out years ago. I checked the railing. It was loose, swaying under the touch of my hand. I couldn't trust it. I began the descent. Floor by floor. The numbers were painted on the walls in peeling yellow stencils. 45, 44, 43. At the 40th floor, the stairs were blocked. A mountain of debris, office furniture, filing cabinets, vending machines, had been piled up, creating a barricade. Someone had tried to hold this line. Bullet holes pockmarked the walls. Dark, dried stains, too old to smell but unmistakable in shape, splashed across the barricade. I couldn't go down. I had to go in. I moved to the landing door. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with the barrel of my rifle, stepping into what had once been a corporate office. Cubicles stretched out in a maze of gray partitions. Papers covered the floor like fallen leaves, yellowed and curling. Quarterly reports. Birthday cards. Evacuation protocols. The windows on the far side of the floor were blown out, letting the city noise drift in, the distant sirens that never stopped, the howling wind. I moved through the cubicles, my weapon raised, checking corners. This was the most dangerous terrain. The interiors. You could walk right past the dormant infected in a cubicle and never know until it was tearing out your throat. I needed to cross the floor to the south side, to find a window that faced the fire escape on the adjacent building. I moved like a ghost, rolling my feet from heel to toe to dampen the sound. In the center of the office, in what looked like a break room, I saw it. A shrine. Candles, hundreds of them, melted down to pools of wax on the tables. And photos. Thousands of photos taped to the walls. People smiling. Families. Dogs. Weddings. In the center of the wall, scrawled in black marker, were the words, *, we are still here. *. I paused, the beam of my light playing over the faces of the dead. It was a memorial. Or a desperate plea. I felt a pang of sorrow so sharp it almost doubled me over. I shook it off. Sorrow gets you killed. Focus on the mission. Focus on the cure. I reached the south windows. The wind whipped through the broken glass, fluttering the blinds. I looked out. The fire escape was there, across the alleyway. It was close. Maybe an 8-foot jump from this window to the rusty metal landing. 8 feet. With a 40-pound pack. 600 feet above the street. I stepped onto the ledge. The glass crunched under my boots. I looked down at the alleyway below. It was a black river of shadow. If I missed, I wouldn't even have time to scream. I backed up to the first row of cubicles to get a running start. I tightened my straps. I checked the landing zone one more time. The metal grating looked corroded. Would it hold my weight? There was only one way to find out. I took a breath, holding it, letting the oxygen saturate my blood. I visualized the jump. The launch. The arc. The landing. 1%, I whispered to the empty office. I ran. The world narrowed down to the vibrating rhythm of my boots on the industrial carpet. Thud. 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 Crunch. The transition from the safety of the interior to the precipice of the ledge was instantaneous. My left boot found purchase on the aluminum frame of the broken window, a jagged tooth of glass slicing shallowly into the rubber sole. I didn't feel it. I only felt the explosive uncoiling of my quadriceps, the desperate heave of my core throwing my center of gravity forward. Away from the solid concrete of the skyscraper and into the howling void. For a heartbeat, I was a creature of the air. The 40-pound pack became a living thing on my back, a parasite of inertia trying to drag me down into the abyss. The wind hit me like a physical blow, a freezing hammer of turbulence that swirled between the two towers. I saw the black river of the alleyway 600 feet down, a dizzying vertical drop that promised nothing but a wet smear on the pavement. But my eyes were locked on the rusty orange grid of the fire escape landing. It rushed toward me, not fast enough, and then too fast. I hit the metal grate. The impact wasn't graceful. It was a violent collision of bone and steel. My boots slammed onto the diamond plate surface, but the momentum was too great to stick the landing. I pitched forward, my chest slamming into the waist-high railing. The air left my lungs in a strangled gasp. The entire structure, a century-old skeleton of iron bolted into crumbling brick, shuddered violently. A piercing screech of metal shearing against metal echoed through the canyon of the alleyway, louder than a gunshot in the silence of the dead city. I froze. I hung there, draped over the railing like a wet towel, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just listened. The screeching faded, replaced by the deep, resonant groaning of the bolts holding the landing to the wall. Dust and rust rained down into the darkness below. I waited for the clicking. I waited for the shriek of the infected being drawn to the noise. 10 seconds. 20. Only the wind answered. The wind, and the distant, rhythmic flapping of a loose tarp somewhere miles away. Slowly, agonizingly, I pulled myself back from the edge. My shoulder throbbed where the strap had dug in during the impact. I checked the grating beneath my feet. It was pitted with corrosion, flaking away in orange scales that disintegrated under my touch. I was standing on a web of rot. I had to move, but I had to move with the lightness of a ghost. I gripped the cold iron of the railing, my gloves finding friction on the wet metal. I looked up. The sky was a bruised purple, the heavy clouds reflecting the non-existent lights of a city that had burned out years ago. I began the descent. The fire escape zigzagged down the side of the residential tower. Every step was a calculation. I kept my weight close to the wall, where the supports were anchored. I tested every step before committing my full mass. Step. Wait. Listen. Step. Wait. Listen. At the 38th floor, the stairs ended. The section below had collapsed, likely years ago, leaving a jagged mauve twisted iron hanging over the drop. I crouched, shining my low-beam light onto the landing I was standing on. To my right, a window. It was painted shut, layers of beige latex sealing the frame, but the glass was intact. I couldn't go down. I had to go inside again. I pulled my knife, sliding the blade between the sash and the sill. I worked it back and forth, cutting through the years of paint. It was slow work. My breath fogged in the air, a small cloud of warmth in the freezing night. With a sharp crack, the paint seal broke. I sheathed the knife and placed my palms flat against the glass, pushing upward. The window groaned, sliding up 6 inches before jamming. I gritted my teeth, straining, veins popping in my neck. It gave another foot. Enough to squeeze through. I slid into the room, rolling onto a hardwood floor that smelled of stale lavender and rot. I remained prone, my rifle instantly in my hands, scanning the gloom. It was a bedroom. A child's bedroom. The beam of my light swept over a canopy bed draped in dusty sheer netting. A rocking horse sat motionless in the corner, its painted eye staring blindly at the wall. The floor was littered with plush toys, their synthetic fur matted with grime. The silence here was heavier than in the office building. That had been a place of work. This was a place where people had slept, loved, and died. The intimacy of the tragedy made the air feel thick, like walking through syrup. I stood up slowly, the floorboards creaking softly. I moved toward the door, stepping over a scattering of Lego bricks. I paused at the threshold, listening to the house. A draft was moving through the hallway. That meant an open window or door somewhere else. I stepped out into the corridor. The wallpaper was peeling in long, fleshy strips, revealing the lath and plaster beneath. I moved toward the kitchen area. The refrigerator door was wide open, its contents long since turned to black sludge. But on the counter, something caught the light. Glass vials. I moved closer, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a standard first aid kit. It was a centrifuge. A small, portable, battery-operated unit, covered in dust but clearly out of place in a family apartment. Next to it were a series of notebooks, their pages swollen with dampness. I picked up the top notebook. The leather cover was stiff. I opened it, the spine cracking. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. Day 14. Fever broke. The subject is stable. No aggression. The inhibitor is working, but the supply is limited. I need to get to the extraction point at the plaza, but the streets are full of them. They are evolving. I saw one today that didn't scream. It just watched. I lowered the book, a chill chasing down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. It just watched. I looked at the date on the entry. It was 3 years after the fall. Someone had been alive here, doing research, long after the evacuation orders. Someone had found an inhibitor. I scanned the counter. There were 3 vials left in a foam rack. 2 were shattered empty. The third was intact, filled with a turbid, amber liquid. I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. This could be it. Not the cure, but a piece of the map. Suddenly, the floorboards in the living room behind me groaned. It wasn't the settling of the building. It was the distinct, rhythmic compression of weight. I froze, my hand hovering inches from the vial. I killed the light. Darkness slammed back into the room, absolute and suffocating. I controlled my breathing, forcing the air in through my nose and out through my mouth, silent and slow. Another creak. Closer. It wasn't shuffling. The infected usually dragged their feet, their motor functions degrading as the virus ate the cerebellum. This was a step. A deliberate, picked up, put down step. I slowly turned, raising the rifle, looking through the night vision scope. The green phosphor screen flickered to life, painting the hallway in grain and shadow. At the end of the hall, standing in the doorway of the child's bedroom I had just vacated, was a silhouette. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Too tall. The arms hung too low. It was naked, its skin pale and translucent in the night vision, stretched tight over knotted muscle and protruding bone. But it wasn't attacking. It wasn't screaming. It was leaning against the doorframe, its head cocked to the side. Watching. Just like the journal said. The creature's eyes reflected the infrared illuminator of my scope, glowing with a dull, predatory luminescence. It didn't have the wild, milky cataracts of the standard infected. Its pupils were sharp, focused pinpricks. It knew I was there. It was assessing me. My finger tightened on the trigger. The silence stretched, a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. If I fired, the noise in this enclosed space would be deafening. It would bring every runner within 3 blocks down on this building. If I didn't fire, I had to trust that I was faster than this thing. The creature raised a hand. It had long, blackened claws where fingernails should be. It tapped a single claw against the wood of the doorframe. Asterisk click. Asterisk. It was mimicking the echolocation clicks of the lower stage infected. But it was doing it softly, teasingly. I realized then that I wasn't the hunter in this room. I was the curiosity. I needed an exit. The window I came in was blocked by the creature. The front door of the apartment was behind me, past the kitchen island. I slowly shifted my weight, stepping back. The creature mimicked me. It took a step forward. Smooth. Fluid. Silent. I backed up again. It advanced again, maintaining the exact distance between us. It was playing with me. I reached behind me with my left hand, blindly feeling for the handle of the apartment door. My fingers brushed the cold metal. I turned the knob. Locked. Of course. The click of the deadbolt trying to turn echoed like a thunderclap. The creature stopped. Its lips peeled back, revealing gums that were black with rot, and teeth that had been sharpened to needle points. A low sound began in its throat, not a growl, but a vibration, a subsonic purr that I felt in my teeth rather than heard. It dropped to all fours. The transformation in posture was instant. It went from a humanoid observer to a quadrupedal predator in the blink of an eye. The muscles in its haunches bunched up, rippling under the paper-thin skin. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't finesse the lock. I kicked the door. The wood around the deadbolt splintered with a deafening crash. I threw myself backward into the hallway of the building, spinning around, bringing the rifle up. The creature shrieked, a sound that was half human scream, half tearing metal, and launched itself from the kitchen floor. It cleared the distance in a single bound, its claws tearing into the drywall where my head had been a fraction of a second before. I sprinted. I didn't look back. I ran down the dark corridor of the residential block, my boots slipping on decades of dust. I heard the skittering of claws on the hardwood behind me, closing the distance. The corridor ended in a stairwell door. I hit the panic bar with my shoulder, bursting onto the landing. I spun, grabbing the door handle to pull it shut, but a clawed hand jammed into the gap. The fingers were impossibly strong, forcing the steel door open against my weight. I saw the face of the thing in the gap, inches from mine. The intelligence in its eyes was gone, replaced by pure, red hunger. I pulled the pin on a flashbang from my belt rig, dropped it at my feet, and kicked the door open, letting the creature stumble through. I vaulted over the railing to the stairs below just as the grenade detonated. The world went white. The concussion wave slammed me into the concrete wall of the stairwell. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all thought. I tumbled down the steps, rolling, protecting my head, until I hit the landing of the floor below. I scrambled up, disoriented, dry heaving from the overpressure. Above me, in the smoke and the ringing silence, I heard a sound that chilled my blood cold. Coughing. The thing was coughing. Like a man. I didn't wait to see if it recovered. I took the stairs 3 at a time, sliding down the railings, plunging deeper into the dark belly of the building. Desperate to put as much concrete between me and the thing that watched. The ringing in my ears wasn't just a sound, it was a physical barrier, a wall of static that separated me from the reality of the stairwell. I stumbled, my shoulder checking the rough concrete of the wall, scraping the heavy canvas of my jacket. The air was thick with the acrid taste of the flashbang's magnesium oxidizer. A metallic tang that coated the back of my throat and made me want to retch. But I swallowed it down. I swallowed the bile and the fear and the urge to scream, forcing my legs to keep moving in a rhythmic, desperate cadence. 1 step. 2 steps. Turn on the landing. Repeat. The stairwell was a vertical tunnel of gloom, lit only by the erratic strobe of my tactical light as it swung with the motion of my body. The beam cut through the floating dust motes, dust that was likely composed of the pulverized drywall of the floors above and the desiccated skin of the city's former inhabitants. Every shadow that stretched and warped against the peeling paint looked like a claw, every dark recess beneath the stairs looked like a waiting mouth. I reached the 4th floor landing and paused for a fraction of a second, my chest heaving against the plates of my vest. I needed to listen. I needed to pierce the veil of tinnitus and hear what was happening above me. I pressed my hand against the cold steel of the railing, using it to ground myself, closing my eyes to focus my remaining senses. At first, there was only the rushing of my own blood, a thumping drumline in my temples. Then, the ringing began to fade, receding like a tide, leaving behind the hollow, amplified silence of the dead building. And then, the sound returned. Asterisk scrape. Thud. Scrape. Asterisk. It wasn't running anymore. It was moving with purpose. The frenzied charge of the beast had been replaced by the methodical stalking of the hunter. It knew I was trapped in the vertical shaft. It knew gravity would bring me down. It didn't need to rush, it just needed to arrive. The coughing had stopped, replaced by a wet, ragged breathing that echoed down the concrete throat of the stairwell. It sounded like a bellows filled with fluid, a wet, rattling gasp that promised violence. I pushed off the railing, my boots finding the next flight of stairs. I stopped running. Running was loud. Running was panic. Panic got you killed. I shifted my weight, rolling my feet from heel to toe, absorbing the impact of each step with my knees. I became a ghost in the machine of the building, descending into the dark underbelly. 3rd floor. The door to the residential hallway here was gone, torn off its hinges years ago. A draft of cold, mildew-scented air drifted out, carrying the smell of rot and wet carpet. I kept my weapon trained on the landing above, moving backward for a few steps, watching the slice of darkness where the creature would appear. My finger hovered over the trigger guard, the polymer feeling slick against my glove. Nothing appeared. Just the sound. Getting closer. I turned and accelerated, skipping the last 3 steps of the flight to hit the second-floor landing. I needed an exit strategy that wasn't just down. If I went all the way to the lobby, I risked running into a horde. The noise of the grenade would have drawn the street-level runners to the front entrance like moths to a flame. I couldn't go out the front. I needed the service tunnels. Every pre-collapse apartment block of this size had a maintenance sublevel, a labyrinth of boiler rooms, storage cages, and utility corridors that usually fed into the alleyways or the sewer access points. It was a gamble. It was a rat's maze. But it was better than the kill box of the main lobby. I hit the ground floor landing. The main door to the lobby was ahead, a heavy fire door with a small, wire-reinforced glass window. Through the grime on the glass, I could see movement. Shadows flitting past the weak light filtering in from the street. They were already there. The mindless ones. The drones. They were scratching at the entrance, agitated by the explosion upstairs. I turned away from the lobby door, scanning the darkness of the stairwell's terminus. There, tucked under the rise of the stairs I had just descended, was a narrower, rust-pitted metal door. Stenciled in fading yellow paint were the words, "Authorized personnel only." I didn't have a key, but I had desperation. I gripped the handle. It turned, grinding against rust, but the door didn't budge. Locked or jammed. Above me, the scraping sound grew louder. The creature was on the second floor. I could hear the click of its claws on the metal railing. It was testing the durability of the structure, perhaps preparing to jump down the center of the shaft to cut me off. I holstered the rifle, letting it hang on the sling, and pulled the pry bar from the loops on my pack. The metal was cold and heavy in my hand. I wedged the chiseled tip into the gap between the door and the frame, right near the latch mechanism. I leaned my weight into it, gritting my teeth. I couldn't afford a loud snap. I needed steady, crushing pressure. The metal groaned. A sound like a dying violin. I froze, looking up through the gap in the stairs. High above, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the second floor. A head, elongated and hairless, peered over the railing. The beam of my shoulder light caught the reflection of its eyes, twin nebulas of malice. It hissed. A sound like steam escaping a valve. I shoved the pry bar with everything I had. The old lock cylinder, corroded by 20 years of damp air, sheared off with a dull clunk. The door swung inward, revealing a maw of absolute blackness. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind me just as a heavy weight slammed into the ground on the other side. The creature had jumped. It impacted the concrete where I had been standing a second ago, the force of its landing vibrating through the soles of my boots. I fumbled in the dark, my fingers tracing the inside of the door frame until I found a slide bolt. I slammed it home. A second later, the door shuddered violently. A claw punched through the metal skin of the door, inches from my face, screeching against the steel before retracting. It began to batter the door, a rhythmic, thunderous pounding that echoed in the confined space of the service corridor. I backed away, bringing my rifle up, the flashlight beam cutting a cone through the thick, stagnant air. I was in a boiler room. Huge, rusted tanks loomed like sleeping giants in the dark, wrapped in asbestos insulation that hung in tatters like Spanish moss. The floor was slick with oily water. I couldn't stay here. That door wouldn't hold forever. It was steel, but the thing on the other side was biological hydraulic machinery. It would peel that door open given enough time. I moved deeper into the room, my boots splashing softly in the muck. The smell here was different, ancient heating oil, rust, and the earthy musk of subterranean decay. I navigated through the maze of pipes, ducking under low-hanging conduits. The heat of the adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by the cold clamminess of shock. My hands were trembling. I forced myself to breathe through my nose. Asterisk in for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Asterisk. The room narrowed into a corridor lined with chain-link storage cages. Most were empty, looted decades ago, but some still held the ghostly remnants of lives interrupted: a bicycle with flat tires, a stack of water-damaged books, a crate of Christmas decorations covered in gray mold. It was a graveyard of trivialities. At the end of the corridor, a red exit sign, long dead, hung crookedly above a set of double doors. This was it. The loading dock or the alley exit. I pushed the crash bar. It didn't move. Rusted solid. I cursed silently, the word forming on my lips but making no sound. I looked back the way I came. The banging on the service door had stopped. That was worse. Silence meant it was thinking. Silence meant it was finding another way in. I inspected the hinges of the double doors. The pins were welded with rust. I looked at the glass panes in the upper half of the doors. Wire-reinforced security glass. Tough to break, and noisy. Then I saw it. To the left of the doors, a ventilation grate near the floor. It was about 2 feet square. I knelt down, the wet knees of my trousers soaking up the grime of the floor. I shone my light through the slats. It led to a window well. I could see the faint, amber glow of the city sky reflecting off wet brick. I used the pry bar again, working the screws that held the grate in place. 2 of them snapped off. The other 2 shrieked in protest as I forced the metal twisting out of the concrete. I pulled the grate free and set it down gently. The crawl space was tight. I had to take off my pack and push it ahead of me. I slid into the shaft on my stomach, the concrete rough against my elbows. The space smelled of dead leaves and wet earth. I dragged myself forward, inch by painful inch, the claustrophobia wrapping around my chest like a python. If the creature found the grate now, I was defenseless. I was a worm in a hole. I reached the end of the shaft and pushed my pack out into the window well. I scrambled out after it, gasping as the fresh, cold air hit my face. It was freezing, the temperature having dropped significantly since I entered the building. I was in a sunken concrete well below street level, covered by an iron grate above. I looked up. The alleyway was narrow, flanked by the towering brick walls of the apartment blocks. Clotheslines still strung between buildings swayed in the wind like hanged men. I stood up in the well, reached through the bars of the overhead grate, and pushed. It was heavy, but not locked. It swung up with a groan of iron. I hauled myself up out of the well and rolled onto the cracked asphalt of the alley. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the strip of purple-black sky between the buildings. The city was vast. It was a canyon of dead windows and silent screams. I sat up and checked my surroundings. The alley was filled with refuse, dumpsters overflowing with 20-year-old trash, stripped carcasses of cars, and piles of debris. But it was empty of movement. I retrieved my pack, shrugging the straps over my shoulders. The weight was familiar, comforting. I checked the magazine in my rifle. 20 rounds left. Not enough. Never enough. I looked back at the building I had just escaped. The back door, the one I had tried to open from the inside, was scarred and dented, but closed. But as I watched, I saw a movement in a third-floor window. A silhouette. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking at the moon. I didn't wait for it to look down. I turned my collar up against the biting wind and began to move. The map I had recovered from the dead courier in Chapter 2 said the entrance to the subterranean lab, the place where the forbidden cure was rumored to be, was under the Great Library, 6 blocks east. 6 blocks in the dead city was a marathon. 6 blocks was a lifetime. I moved to the mouth of the alley, hugging the brickwork. The main avenue stretched out before me, a river of shadows. I could hear them out there. The shuffling steps of the infected. The distant wails. But I also heard something else. A low hum. Mechanical. Distant. A drone? I crouched behind the rusted hulk of a delivery truck, narrowing my eyes. If the paramilitaries were patrolling this deep in the red zone, things were more complicated than I thought. The cure wasn't just forbidden, it was guarded. I checked my compass. East. I took the first step out of the alley, leaving the nightmare of the apartment block behind, only to step into the waking nightmare of the streets. The silence here was deceptive. It was a silence that waited. And I had miles to go before I could sleep. The transition from the claustrophobia of the ventilation shaft to the exposure of the street was a physical shock, like being doused in ice water. I pressed my back against the rough, cold brick of the alley mouth, my chest heaving against the canvas of my jacket. I needed to calibrate. Survival isn't just about moving, it is about sensing. It is about becoming part of the background noise so that the predators don't pick you out from the static. The wind out here was different. In the building, the air had been stagnant, heavy with the copper scent of old blood and mold. Here, the wind was alive. It whipped down the canyon of the main avenue, carrying with it the grit of a decaying civilization. It tasted of ozone, wet ash, and the underlying, sickly sweet perfume of unburied death. I licked my cracked lips, tasting the city's rot. My breath plumed before me in ragged white clouds, dissipating instantly in the gale. I pulled my scarf tighter, burying my nose in the wool, trying to reclaim some warmth, but the cold had teeth. It gnawed at the exposed skin of my wrists and the back of my neck, seeking to numb the nerves I needed most. I looked down at my rifle. The metal receiver was frosted over, a thin sheen of white crystal blooming on the black steel. I wiped it away with a gloved thumb. 20 rounds. The weight of the weapon was a constant reminder of my limitations. In the dead city, ammunition was currency, and I was poor. I shifted the strap, letting the familiar ache settle into my shoulder. It was a good ache. It meant I was still armed. It meant I wasn't just meat waiting to be processed. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I peeked around the corner of the rusted delivery truck. The avenue stretched out like a dried riverbed, the asphalt cracked and buckled where weeds the size of saplings had forced their way through. Cars sat in chaotic clusters, frozen in the panicked gridlock of evacuation day 20 years ago. They were husks now, stripped of paint, tires flattened into black puddles of rubber. Windshields shattered into diamonds that glittered under the moonlight. It was a graveyard of industry. And then, the sound returned. That low, mechanical hum. It wasn't the wind. I pulled back instantly, pressing myself flat against the rusted panel of the truck. The vibration buzzed against my spine. It was coming from the south, moving north. Towards me. I sank into a crouch, making myself small, tucked between the truck's rear tire and a pile of sodden cardboard boxes. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Above, the hum grew into a distinct whine, the sound of high-torque rotors cutting the air. A drone. I dared to look up, peering through the gap between the truck's undercarriage and the pavement. A shadow swept across the debris-strewn street. It was massive, far larger than the consumer toys from before the fall. This was military grade. A quadrotor predator, matte black against the purple night sky. A searchlight beam, blindingly white, stabbed down from its belly, sweeping the street in a methodical grid pattern. The beam hit a cluster of abandoned sedans 20 yards away. The light was so intense it seemed to bleach the color from the world, turning the rust and grime into stark monochrome. I saw the dust motes dancing in the cone of light, swirling in the turbulence of the rotors. The drone hovered there, the camera turret on its underbelly swiveling with a microscopic whir that I felt in my teeth. It was looking. Scanning. Hunting. If it had thermal imaging, I was dead. I pressed my hands into the freezing slush beneath the truck, trying to lower my body temperature, trying to merge with the cold earth. The drone drifted closer. The wash from its rotors kicked up a cloud of trash, candy wrappers from 2 decades ago, dead leaves, pages from a dissolved newspaper. The debris swirled around my hiding spot. The light swept over the truck. For a second, the world was nothing but blinding white and terrifying shadow. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a god who had left this city long ago. I waited for the chatter of a mounted machine gun, or the hiss of a gas canister. But the light passed. The drone lingered for another 10 seconds, a suspended vulture of steel and circuitry, before it banked sharply to the east and accelerated away, the whine of its engines fading into the ambient moan of the wind. I didn't move. Not yet. Patience is the only virtue that matters here. I counted to 100, feeling the cold seep through my trousers, turning my knees to stone. Only when silence returned, the heavy, oppressive silence of the void, did I exhale. They were guarding the sector. The map was right. You don't patrol a graveyard unless there is something buried there worth stealing. The cure. It had to be real. I crawled out from under the truck, my joints popping in protest. I brushed the slush from my coat and checked my compass again. East. 6 blocks. It sounded so simple. Just a straight line. But in the red zone, there are no straight lines. I began to move, sticking to the shadows of the storefronts. The glass of the shop windows had been blown out years ago, leaving jagged teeth in the frames. I stepped carefully, rolling my feet from heel to toe to dampen the crunch of broken safety glass. Inside the dark maws of the shops, I could see the remnants of the old world. Mannequins, overturned and limbless, looking like pale corpses in the gloom. Racks of rotting clothes. A coffee shop with cups still sitting on the tables, a thick layer of gray dust covering them like a shroud. It was a museum of the exact moment the world ended. First block down. I crossed an intersection, crouching low, sprinting across the open ground. My boots slapped wetly against the pavement. I dove behind a concrete planter filled with dead, thorny briars. I waited. Listened. Nothing but the wind. Second block. Here, the smell changed. The ozone faded, replaced by something sweeter, thicker. Decay. Not the dry decay of old paper, but the wet, cloying stench of organic rot. I slowed my pace, raising the rifle to my shoulder. Ahead, in the center of the street, stood a city bus. It was jackknifed, its accordion center torn open as if by a giant hand. And around it, they were waiting. The infected. I stopped dead, merging with the shadows of a doorway. There were maybe a dozen of them. They weren't moving. This far into the city, where food was scarce, they went dormant to conserve energy. They stood like statues in the moonlight, their heads lolling on broken necks, their arms hanging limp. They looked like commuters waiting for a bus that would never come. Their skin was gray, stretched tight over bone, mottled with the black veins of the virus. I couldn't shoot. The noise would bring the drone back, or worse, wake every sleeper for a mile. I had to go around. I looked up. The building to my right was an old bank, its facade dominated by stone pillars. There was a ledge, about 10 feet up, running along the side. If I could reach it, I could bypass the horde. I slung the rifle and approached the wall. The stonework was rough, eroded by acid rain. I found a grip, a decorative lion's head, half crumbled, and pulled. My muscles burned. Every ounce of energy I had spent in the apartment block earlier screamed at me. I gritted my teeth, suppressing a grunt of exertion. I hauled myself up, my boots scrambling for purchase on the slippery stone. I made the ledge. I lay flat on the cold stone, looking down. I was directly above them now. One of the creatures shifted. It was a female, or it had been once. It wore the tatters of a business suit. It let out a low, gurgling wheeze, pivoting on a twisted ankle. It looked up. I froze. I didn't breathe. I stared into the milky cataracts of its eyes. It sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. The wind was in my favor, blowing my scent back toward the way I came. It held its gaze for a terrifying eternity, then slowly, twitching, lowered its head back to its chest. I crept along the ledge, inch by inch, a gargoyle moving in the night. Below me, the cluster of monsters remained silent, a minefield of flesh and teeth. It took me 20 minutes to cover the length of the block. 20 minutes of agonizing tension, where a scuffed boot or a falling pebble would mean death. When I finally dropped down on the other side of the intersection, my legs were shaking so hard I could barely stand. 4 blocks down. 2 to go. The architecture began to change. The utilitarian apartment blocks and shops gave way to the grand, imperial style of the old civic center. The buildings here were massive, monolithic structures of granite and marble, designed to intimidate. They loomed over me, blocking out the moon, casting the street in absolute darkness. I navigated by the faint gray ribbon of the sky above. The silence here was heavier. It felt respectful, almost church-like. And then I saw it. The great library. It emerged from the gloom like a mountain range. A massive flight of stairs, wide enough for an army, led up to a portico of towering columns. The roof was a shattered dome, its skeletal ribs reaching up like the fingers of a dead giant. It was magnificent and terrifying. I moved toward the stairs, keeping low. The map said the entrance to the lab was in the sub-basement. But to get there, I had to cross the plaza. The plaza was a wasteland of open concrete. In the center stood a fountain, dry and filled with bones. I scanned the area. No cover. If the drone returned, I would be a bug on a plate. If there were snipers in the upper windows of the library, I was already dead. But I had come too far to turn back. I had survived the courier, the apartment block, the ventilation shaft, the cold, and the sleepers. I took a deep breath, the freezing air burning my lungs one last time. I tightened my grip on the rifle. I stepped out onto the plaza, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty amphitheater of the dead city. I was exposed. I was vulnerable. But as I looked at the dark, gaping maw of the library entrance, I felt a strange pull. The cure was down there. The end of this nightmare was down there. I began to climb the stairs, one by one, ascending into the darkness of the old world's knowledge, hoping to find the future buried in its grave. The ascent was a pilgrimage of pain. My quadriceps, already screaming from the climb up the bank's facade, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony that seemed to synchronize with the pounding of my heart. Each step on the great library's staircase was a slab of polished granite, slick with a microscopic film of ice that demanded absolute precision. I didn't look up at the shattered dome, I looked at my boots. I watched the leather crease and flatten, the worn rubber soles hunting for friction on the freezing stone. One step. Breathe. The air was thinner here, or maybe it was just the crushing weight of the architecture pressing the oxygen out of the atmosphere. The columns of the portico grew larger with every stride, expanding until they were no longer architectural features but titans of gray stone. Indifferent sentinels watching a flea crawl across the threshold of a tomb. I reached the top. The grand entrance was a maw of darkness. The massive bronze doors, once gleaming symbols of public access, had been forced inward decades ago. They stood askew, frozen in a state of permanent violation, their surfaces oxidized to a sickly, aquatic green. I pressed my back against the cold bronze of the left door, sliding into the sliver of shadow between the metal and the stone frame. I waited. Survival is 90% waiting, listening for the cadence of death. I closed my eyes and pushed my senses outward. I listened for the wet slap of bare feet on marble, the clicking of teeth, the mechanical whir of the drone. There was nothing but the wind whistling mournfully through the skeletal ribs of the dome far above. I slipped inside. The transition was immediate and visceral. The biting cold of the plaza was replaced by a stagnant, heavy chill that smelled of vanilla and graves. It was the scent of lignin breaking down, millions of books, decomposing in the dark, their pages turning to dust and releasing the chemical memory of the forests they once were. It was a sweet, cloying rot that coated the back of my throat. I didn't dare turn on my light. The moon filtering through the shattered roof provided a ghostly, erratic illumination, painting the rotunda in shades of charcoal and bone. The main hall was a cavern of shadows. In the center, the information desk sat like a wrecked ship in a sea of debris. Books were piled in drifts against the walls, heaps of knowledge that had been pulled from the shelves and abandoned. I moved through them, stepping high, placing my feet with the deliberate slowness of a stalking cat. A crunch of paper here would sound like a gunshot. My eyes adjusted, the rods and cones working overtime to resolve shapes in the gloom. Statues of long-dead poets and philosophers loomed in alcoves, their stone eyes judging my intrusion. I felt a profound sense of trespassing. This wasn't just a building, it was the corpse of civilization's memory, and I was a parasite crawling through its skull. According to the mental map I had memorized from the dossier, the access to the sub-basement archives, and the hidden lab beneath them, was located in the service wing, behind the main reading room. I navigated the periphery of the rotunda, hugging the wall. The plaster was peeling in sheets, hanging like dead skin. I passed a row of reading tables, the chairs overturned, laptops sitting open and covered in a thick, gray fur of dust. A coffee cup sat next to one, the liquid inside long evaporated, leaving a black ring of residue. It was a freeze frame of the panic. The moment the world ended, someone had been researching, or studying, or writing, and they had simply run. I reached the archway leading to the reading room. It was a vast, cathedral-like space, lined with 3 stories of balconies filled with books. The moonlight here was brighter, slicing down from the skylights in jagged beams. And in the center of the room, I saw why the silence felt so heavy. The floor was gone. A massive section of the reading room floor had collapsed, likely years ago, surrendering to the weight of the structure or the vibration of distant bombings. It was a jagged crater, 20 feet across, plunging down into the darkness of the lower levels. The service door I needed was on the other side of the crater. I crouched low, analyzing the gap. There was a narrow walkway remaining along the left wall, a strip of flooring perhaps 2 feet wide, bordered by the wall on one side and the abyss on the other. It was littered with fallen books and debris. If I slipped, I wouldn't just fall, I would crash into the unknown depths below, breaking bones and alerting whatever lived in the basement. I checked the rifle. It was secure on my back. I couldn't afford it swinging and knocking against the wall. I stepped onto the ledge. The wood groaned. It was a low, mournful sound, the protest of timber that hadn't held weight in a generation. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sound died away, leaving the heavy silence in its wake. I took another step. Then another. The psychological strain was heavier than the physical. Every shadow seemed to stretch and grasp at my ankles. I looked down into the pit. The darkness was absolute. It swallowed the light, refusing to reflect anything back. I imagined things down there, twisted limbs, pale eyes looking up, waiting for the morsel to drop. Vertigo spun in my inner ear, a dizzying pull urging me to lean out, to surrender to gravity. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, forcing the biological panic back into its cage. Asterisk focus. Foot placement. Weight distribution. Breathe. Asterisk. I was halfway across when my boot landed on a hardback book hidden beneath a layer of dust. The cover was slick. My foot slid outward, toward the edge. Panic flared hot and bright. My arms windmill, fingers scrabbling for purchase on the smooth plaster of the wall. My right leg slipped off the edge, dangling into the void. The rough wood of the broken floorboard scraped against my shin, tearing the fabric of my trousers. I gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded deafening in the quiet. I slammed my chest against the remaining floor, hugging the narrow strip of wood, my fingers digging into the gaps between the boards. I hung there for a moment, half suspended over the dark, the blood rushing in my ears. A pebble, dislodged by my slip, fell into the crater. Asterisk 1. 2. 3. Asterisk. Asterisk clack. Asterisk. The sound of the pebble hitting the floor below was sharp and distinct. It wasn't an endless pit. It was maybe a 15-foot drop. Survivable, perhaps, but loud. I hauled myself up, dragging my leg back onto the ledge, my muscles trembling with adrenaline tremors. I lay flat on the dusty wood, waiting for a reaction from below. A hiss? A shuffle? A scream? Nothing. Just the settling of the building, the groan of old materials expanding and contracting in the cold. I crawled the rest of the way. Standing was too risky. I moved on hands and knees, ignoring the sharp debris biting into my palms, until I reached the solid floor on the far side of the room. I rolled away from the edge and lay on my back, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, trying to slow my respiration rate. My breath plumed above me, a rhythmic fog in the moonlight. I checked my watch. 0300 hours. Dawn was still hours away, but my timeline was shrinking. I pushed myself up. The service door was ahead, a nondescript gray metal slab labeled staff only. I approached it, the rifle back in my hands. The handle was a simple lever. I tried it. Locked. Of course. I knelt, pulling my lockpick set from my belt. My fingers were stiff with cold, clumsy. I blew on them, the warm breath providing a fleeting moment of dexterity. I inserted the tension wrench, then the rake. I worked by feel, listening to the tiny, tactile clicks of the pin setting. The mechanism was gritty, filled with years of dust, but it was mechanical, logical. It was a puzzle I could solve, unlike the chaos outside. Asterisk click. Click. Clunk. Asterisk. The cylinder turned. The sound was obscenely loud, a metal snap that echoed through the reading room. I paused again, rifle raised, sweeping the dark corners behind me. The shadows remained still. I pushed the lever down. The latch disengaged. I pulled the door open. The air that drifted up from the stairwell wasn't just cold, it was sterile. It didn't smell of rot or books. It smelled of ozone and antiseptic, faint but distinct. It was the smell of the old world science, preserved in a hermetically sealed tomb. The darkness down the stairs was thicker, heavier, a solid wall of black ink. This was it. The sub-basement. The forbidden cure. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, crank-powered flashlight. I gave the handle a few slow turns, shielding the noise with my body. A weak beam of yellow light cut into the dark, illuminating concrete steps descending into the abyss. I stepped onto the first stair, leaving the majestic ruin of the library behind. Descending into the belly of the beast where hope and horror waited in equal measure. The descent was not a journey through distance, but a journey through time. With every step I took down that concrete spiral, the dust of the ruined world above seemed to recede, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. The air grew colder, sharper. It lost the organic musk of rotting paper and timber, replaced by the stinging, chemical tang of ozone and old bleach. It was the smell of a hospital waiting room left to ferment for a decade in the dark. I counted the steps to anchor my mind. 31. 32. The beam of my hand-cranked flashlight was a pathetic, yellow cone in the crushing blackness. It caught only fragments of the reality around me, a rusted handrail bolted to raw concrete, a scuff mark on the wall. A spiderweb trembling in the updraft caused by my own movement. The silence was absolute, yet heavy. It wasn't the peace of nature, it was the silence of a tomb, the held breath of a machine that had been waiting for an operator since the bombs fell. My boots, wrapped in layers of burlap to muffle sound, made soft, scuffing noises against the grit. I stopped at the first landing. My breath plumed before me, thick and white, lingering in the stagnant air. I checked my pulse. Thud. 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 Too fast. The adrenaline from the near fall in the library was metabolizing into a cold, shivering dread. I forced myself to swallow, the dry click of my throat sounding obscenely loud. Below me, the stairs continued into the abyss. I gave the flashlight handle 3 slow cranks. The dynamo whined, a mechanical mosquito sound that made me wince. The light flared brighter, revealing a heavy steel door at the bottom of the flight. I descended the final 12 steps with my rifle tucked into my shoulder, the barrel sweeping the landing. There was nothing here but the door. It was an industrial blast door, painted a sickly institutional green, peeling away in flakes to reveal the gray steel beneath. A faded yellow placard was riveted to the center at eye level. Biosafety Level 4. Authorized personnel only. Lethal force enabled. The words were a warning from a dead empire. I traced the letters with a gloved finger, wiping away a layer of grime. The lock mechanism was electronic, a keypad dead and dark next to the frame. But beside it, a manual override wheel, secured with a heavy chain. I didn't have bolt cutters. I had time, and I had desperation. I set the rifle down, propping it against the cold concrete. From my pack, I retrieved a small bottle of acid, scavenged from a car battery 3 days ago, and an eyedropper. I knelt before the chain, my knees aching on the hard floor. The process was agonizingly slow. I applied the acid to the lock's shackle, drop by careful drop. The chemical hissed, a tiny, angry sound, bubbling against the hardened steel. The fumes rose, stinging my eyes, making them water. I blinked the tears away, refusing to wipe them, refusing to break focus. 5 minutes. 10. The silence pressed in. I started hearing things in the void behind me, phantom footsteps on the stairs, the rustle of clothing. I whipped my head around, flashlight cutting the dark. Nothing but the empty steps rising back up to the library. Just nerves. Just the brain trying to process sensory deprivation. Finally, the acid did its work. The metal grew thin, pitted. I inserted a pry bar into the loop and leaned my entire body weight against it. My boots slipped slightly on the grit. I gritted my teeth, straining until the veins in my neck bulged. Asterisk snap. Asterisk. The sound was like a gunshot. The chain fell away, clattering to the floor. I froze, grabbing the rifle, holding my breath, waiting for the consequences. Silence returned. I holstered the weapon and gripped the wheel. It was cold enough to burn through my gloves. I turned it. It resisted, groaning with the friction of rust and disuse. Metal screamed against metal, a high-pitched shriek that vibrated through my bones. I kept turning. 1 rotation. 2. The heavy tumblers inside the door clunked back, deep, resonant sounds that felt like the heartbeats of a leviathan. With a final heave, the door unsealed. A hiss of equalizing pressure escaped, air from inside rushing out to meet me. It smelled of refined death. Formaldehyde. Copper. And something sweet, like rotting flowers. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, surprisingly light. I stepped into the decontamination antechamber. The floor here was tiled in white, surprisingly clean. Overhead, emergency strip lighting flickered with a weak, reddish hue, powered by some dying backup generator deep in the earth. The intermittent buzz of the lights was the only sound. To my left and right were shower nozzles, dry now. I moved through the plastic strip curtains, the heavy vinyl slapping softly against my shoulders. Beyond lay the main corridor of the facility. It was a hallway of glass and steel. Observation windows lined the walls. I approached the first one, wiping the condensation from the glass with my sleeve. I shone my light inside. It was a laboratory. Papers were scattered across the floor in a chaotic spread, frozen in the moment of panic when the evacuation order came. Beakers sat on counters, the liquids inside evaporated into colored crusts. But it was the chair in the center that held my gaze. A skeleton sat there, draped in a white lab coat. One skeletal hand was still gripped around a pistol resting on the desk. The skull was tilted back, staring at the ceiling tiles. A suicide. A quick exit before the virus took hold. I moved on. The corridor seemed to stretch for miles. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for me. I kept my back to the wall, rifle raised, moving with the practiced shuffle of a scavenger, heel to toe, rolling the weight, silent. I passed a room labeled incubation. The door was slightly ajar. I shouldn't have looked. Curiosity is a survival flaw. But I pushed the door with the barrel of my rifle. Inside, rows of glass cylinders stood like pillars. Most were shattered, the floor slick with a dark, resinous substance. But one, at the far end, was intact. A murky green liquid filled it, backlit by a failing power cell at its base. Floating inside was something. It looked human, but wrong. Elongated limbs. The jaw unhinged. The skin was translucent, revealing a network of black veins that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. My stomach turned over. This wasn't just where they studied the virus. This was where they tried to weaponize it. Or maybe, this was the result of the first attempts at a cure. A mutation. I backed out of the room, closing the door as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking. I had to grip the rifle tighter to steady them. Focus. The objective. The vault. According to the map I had memorized, the tattered blueprint found in the dead captain's pocket. The primary containment vault was at the end of this corridor, sublevel 3, sector Omega. I reached the end of the hall. A massive circular door blocked the way, like the entrance to a bank vault, but infinitely more complex. In the center of the door was a thick glass porthole. I peered through. The chamber beyond was bathed in a freezing blue light. Liquid nitrogen mist rolled across the floor in slow, heavy waves. In the center of the room, on a pedestal of stainless steel, sat a single, reinforced case. The cure. It was real. It wasn't a myth whispered by dying men in the wasteland. It was right there, separated from me by 6 inches of steel and glass. I looked at the control panel next to the door. It was active. A small screen glowed with green text, *system standby. Biometric scan required. I didn't have a biometric key. I didn't have a handprint or a retina scan. But I had the bypass module I'd spent 3 months building from scavenge tech, a ugly brick of wires and circuit boards taped together. I pried the faceplate off the control panel with my knife. A tangle of wires spilled out. I connected the alligator clips of my device to the locking mechanism's solenoid leads. Please work. Please, God, just this once. I flipped the switch on my device. Sparks showered down, stinging my hands. The screen flickered. Access denied. I swore, adjusting the frequency dial. Access denied. Security protocol initiated. My blood ran cold. The red emergency lights in the hallway suddenly stopped flickering. They went solid blood red. A siren began to wind up, a low, growing wail that vibrated in the floor. Whoop. 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 Then, a mechanical voice, smooth and terrifyingly calm, echoed from the speakers overhead. Unauthorized containment breach detected. Releasing Subject 9 for asset protection. Subject 9. From the darkness of the corridor behind me, the way I had just come, I heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of boots. It was the sound of wet, slapping flesh on tile. It was the sound of claws clicking against the floor. And the heavy, ragged breathing of something that had just woken up very, very hungry. I looked at the vault door. It was still locked. I looked back down the red-lit hallway. A shadow detached itself from the ceiling, massive and misshapen, dropping to the floor with a bone-jarring thud. It blocked my only exit. I was trapped between the impossible lock and the nightmare. I turned back to the keypad, my fingers flying, sweat stinging my eyes. The creature let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. It began to charge. The shriek was a physical blow, a wave of pressure that rattled my teeth and sent a spike of white-hot adrenaline through my nervous system. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. To look at death is to invite it, and I was too busy bargaining with the machine in front of me. My fingers, slick with sweat and grime, felt like clumsy sausages of flesh as they danced over the exposed wiring of the bypass module. The creature, Subject 9, was closing the distance. I could hear the wet slap of its gait changing into a thunderous gallop. The sound of heavy meat impacting the linoleum with the force of a hydraulic press. I twisted the frequency dial. The screen on my makeshift device flickered from red to amber. Not green. Not yet. The siren overhead was a rhythmic hammer blow to the skull. Whoop. 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 It was designed to disorient, to panic, to freeze the intruder in place so the asset protection could do its messy work. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, using the sharp flare of pain to anchor my focus. 10 meters. I could hear the whistle of air entering the creature's massive, mutated lungs. 5 meters. The smell hit me then, a vile cocktail of rotten ozone, old blood, and the chemical tang of formaldehyde. "Come on," I hissed, the words strangled in my throat. "Open, you bastard." I jammed the alligator clip onto the secondary solenoid lead, ignoring the spark that seared my thumb. The screen flashed. A cascade of numbers tumbled down the green display, too fast to read, a digital waterfall of encryption keys being shattered one by one. Behind me, the air displaced. A shadow fell over the console, swallowing the red light. I felt the heat of the thing, a radiant furnace of metabolic rage. A heavy, metallic clank echoed from within the vault door. The pistons retracted. The hiss of depressurization sounded like a choir of snakes. I didn't wait for the door to swing fully open. I threw my shoulder against the heavy steel, driving my legs into the floor. Slipping through the gap the moment it was wide enough to admit a human ribcage. As I tumbled through, something struck the door behind me with the force of a derailed train. The steel vibrated against my back, singing a low, terrified note. A claw, black and serrated like obsidian, hooked around the edge of the frame, inches from my face. It scrabbled for purchase, gouging deep furrows into the blast-proof metal, shrieking like a banshee. I kicked the internal locking lever. The hydraulic seal engaged. The door slammed shut, severing the tip of the black claw, which fell to the floor, twitching and leaking a corrosive yellow fluid. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The transition was jarring. 1 second, the world was a cacophony of sirens and screaming monsters. The next, I was entombed in a cathedral of quiet. But it was the cold that took me first. It wasn't just cold. It was an absence of thermal energy so profound it felt like a vacuum. The air here was thin, crisp, and smelled of nothing. No rot. No dust. Just the sterile, biting scent of liquid nitrogen and stainless steel. I lay on the floor for a moment, gasping, my breath pluming before me in thick, white clouds that crystallized instantly in the air. The sweat on my forehead froze, tightening my skin. I forced myself up. Hypothermia would set in within minutes if I didn't keep moving. The vault was a circle of blue ice. Pipes ran along the ceiling, coated in inches of hoarfrost, dripping a slow, mesmerizing fog that pulled around my boots. And there it was. The pedestal. I walked toward it, my footsteps ringing hollow on the metal grate floor. The movement felt dreamlike, slowed by the cold and the sheer magnitude of the moment. I had walked 1,000 miles for this. I had killed men who were once fathers and brothers. I had eaten things that would make a rat gag. I had lost my name, my past, and my humanity, all for the contents of this room. The case was simple. Brushed aluminum, glass front, biometric seals. Inside sat a single vial. It wasn't the murky green slop I had seen in the incubation room. This liquid was clear, but it seemed to capture the light, refracting the blue ambient glow into a spectrum of colors that didn't seem to belong in this dead world. A double helix of gold filament was suspended in the solution, spinning slowly, powered by some internal reaction that defied entropy. The cure. Not a treatment. Not a vaccine. A reset button for the human genome. The holy grail that the dead city had swallowed and kept hidden in its belly. I reached out, my hand trembling not from fear, but from a terrifying reverence. My fingertips brushed the cold glass of the case. Boom! The vault door behind me buckled. A spiderweb of cracks appeared in the center of the heavy steel. Dust rained down from the frosted ceiling pipes. Subject 9 wasn't done. Boom! The metal groaned, pushed inward like wet clay. The creature was ramming it. The biometric lock on the inside sparked and died. The fail-safes were holding, but for how long? Physics has a limit, and that thing outside was an abomination that ignored the rules of nature. I looked around the room, frantic. There was no other exit. This was a tomb. I was trapped in a freezer with the salvation of mankind, about to be turned into paste by a biological nightmare. My eyes locked onto the ceiling pipes. Liquid nitrogen coolant lines. High pressure. Boom. A gap appeared in the door frame. A long, wet snout pushed through, sniffing the air. Rows of needle teeth gnashed, dripping saliva that steamed when it hit the frozen floor. An eye, yellow and slit-pupilled, rolled wildly, fixing on me. It let out a low, gurgling growl that vibrated in my chest cavity. I raised my rifle. The action was stiff with cold. I racked the bolt, praying the firing pin wouldn't shatter. "You want it?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Come and get it." The door gave way. With a screech of tearing metal that sounded like the earth screaming, the hinges snapped. The massive slab of steel fell inward, crashing onto the grating. Subject 9 flowed into the room. It was magnificent in its horror. 10 feet tall at the shoulder, a mass of exposed muscle and chitinous plating. It walked on 4 limbs, but the front 2 were human arms, elongated and twisted, ending in scythe-like talons. It had no skin, just raw, red weeping flesh held together by the black veins I had seen on the test subjects. It roared, a sound that blasted the mist away, and charged. I didn't shoot at the monster. I aimed at the ceiling. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, the muzzle flashed blinding in the blue gloom. The bullet sparked off the overhead piping, punching a clean hole through the main distribution line directly above the creature. A jet of liquid nitrogen, compressed to 3,000 psi, erupted from the pipe. It hit Subject 9 squarely on the spine. The scream the creature made was not of this world. It was the sound of biology failing. The nitrogen, colder than the surface of Pluto, flash froze the exposed muscle instantly. The red flesh turned white, then gray, then black. The creature tried to lunge, but its momentum was its enemy now. As it stepped forward, the frozen tissue in its legs shattered like glass under the weight of its own body. It crashed to the floor, thrashing. I fired again. And again. Rupturing more lines. A curtain of freezing death rained down on the beast. It snapped its jaws at me, inches from my boots, but the frost was spreading fast. Its eyes glazed over, turning to milky marbles. The roar died down to a whimper, and then to silence. Subject 9 was now a statue, a grotesque monument of ice in the center of the room. I stood there, the rifle clicking empty in my hands. The cold was unbearable now. My vision was tunneling. The air in the room was being displaced by the nitrogen gas. I had seconds before I suffocated. I holstered the weapon. I walked to the case. With the butt of my knife, I smashed the glass. I took the vial. It was warm. In this frozen hell, the cure was warm. I shoved it into the reinforced pouch on my vest, right over my heart. I stepped over the shattered remains of the vault door, stepping carefully around the frozen monstrosity. I didn't look at it. I didn't look back at the lab, or the incubation tubes, or the dead scientists in the hall. I walked back up the corridor, into the red emergency lights. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion. My leg was bleeding, I hadn't noticed when I did it, and my ribs felt cracked. But I was moving. I climbed the emergency stairs, flight after flight, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. Up past sub-level 2. Past the lobby. Past the barricades. I pushed open the heavy blast doors of the main entrance. The light blinded me. Not the red of alarms, or the blue of the vault. White. Pure, unfiltered, scorching sunlight. I stumbled out into the dust of the wasteland. The wind whipped my coat, carrying the taste of sand and ash. The ruins of the city stretched out before me, a skeleton of a civilization that had forgotten how to live. I fell to my knees, not in defeat, but in prayer. I pulled the vial from my chest. It caught the sun, glowing like a captured star. They said the survival rate was 1%. They said the city was a tomb. They said there was no hope left in this world. I looked at the vial, and then I looked at the horizon, where the faint outline of the survivor settlements shimmered in the heat haze. I uncorked my canteen and took a drink of warm, stale water. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. 1%, I whispered to the wind. That was all we needed.